Hello, sewing friends. I'm Katrina Walker here, broadcasting from my studio in Spokane, Washington, for, of course, those of you here watching the National Sewing Circle. And it's spring here right now, and we're in the mood for something decorative, right? Goodbye, winter. Let's do something festive. It's spring. So, the topic today is decorative stitching. And oftentimes when we think about decorative stitching, what we think of is like machine embroidery, like what's on the lapel of my jacket. But actually, your sewing machine, most sewing machines have at least some decorative stitches. Some have a whole ton of decorative stitches. But I am going to tell you, so before I tell you that, I'm going to talk a little bit about, we're going to talk about the tools, techniques, and inspiration. So, because when people sew decorative stitches, they often are frustrated because it doesn't look the way they think it should. They're not getting the results they want. So, I'm going to help you to understand how to sew decorative stitches so that hopefully next time you'll be thrilled with the results. And a lot of it has to do with the tools you're using. So, we're going to start with those. Okay, so when we talk about the kind of tools that we need for stitching, mainly we're talking about feet, okay? And believe it or not, the foot that you use for your sewing machine really does matter. And actually, I'm going to put this on my sewing machine close up because I think it'll be even, there we go, even bigger. Okay, so here I have some sewing machine feet. Oh, and before I forget, because I get so excited, and of course, feel free to chime in, say hello. And there is instructions. There is a download available for this lecture, this little mini workshop, that has basically the whole thing. There's the QR code on the screen, and that will, if you go ahead and download that guide, it has basically all the written notes for this, so that you don't have to write them down yourself. I've already written them for you. So anyhow, make sure to use that QR code to get your download, and you can have some awesome notes if you haven't already. I guess you wouldn't have had a chance to already do so. Any rate, so back to feet. So most people are sewing, when you're doing most of your regular sewing, you're sewing on just a regular straight stitch foot. Now, I'm sewing on a particular brand that has what's called dual feeds. So my foot looks a little different than some of yours in that there's a notch in the back to make room for the dual feed that's reaches in. So it's basically feed dogs on the top, right? So I have feed dogs top and bottom. So that's what this notch is. So if my foot looks a little weird to you, that's why. But this is the 0A foot for my brand, and this is a straight stitching foot. So how can I tell? Well, if you look at this foot, do you see how there's a little groove here? There's the markings on the clear, but there's a little groove here, but otherwise it's pretty much flat across the back of it. Okay, that's because it's for straight stitching. It's not supposed to be used for anything wider than that. Now these 2 feet are meant to do decorative stitches. So if you look at the back of them, do you see how it's indented? So there's actually kind of a tunnel there. There's an indent here, and that allows those wider stitches. See how it's indented there? That's a tunnel. And if your foot has a tunnel on the back of it, it's designed for decorative stitches so that those stitches can flow freely underneath your foot. Otherwise, what will tend to happen is the foot can kind of get caught up on the extra thread on those wider stitches, and it doesn't flow. It doesn't sew smoothly through your machine, and that causes problems. Now, some stitches, your decorative foot probably looks a little bit more like this. So on my machine, there are some stitches that don't, how do I put this? Okay, they sew back and forth, but they also sew sideways. There we go. That's the language I'm looking for. So in this case, the machine has to be able to move the fabric in every possible direction. And so this does have the tunnel to accommodate those thicker, deeper stitches, but it also is smoother and wider, and so it has the ability to slide around on the fabric sideways a little better as well. So Hello, Paula from Iowa. Good to see you. So I'm going to just go ahead and put, whoops, not the straight stitching foot, but my regular, I'm going to just leave my dual feed attached right now, put my regular sewing foot on. But you need to understand that there is a difference. And so if you're having difficulty, one of the things to look at is your feet. You may be using the incorrect foot for doing decorative stitches. So I'm going to put these other two away. Now there are some feet that are really extreme, and I just looking in my little toolkit here, I forgot to grab it, but for certain specialty stitches like candle wicking stitches, if you want to sew a candle wicking stitch is built up like knots. They require a very deep tunnel, and so there's a special foot for that. So there are some specialty stitches that require a special foot or they won't sew properly. All right, well, we're at the machine also. I do recommend for a lot of top stitching, I like to use a top stitch needle. Now, it doesn't have to be a gold top stitch needle. This was a nice, complete package I had. Top stitch needles have a deeper groove in the front so that you can accommodate more types of thread. So what'll happen sometimes with decorative stitches is sometimes you'll get thread breakage because of friction against the fabric. Believe it or not, this can happen. It happens more in machine embroidery. We're going really fast, but it can happen in sewing too. This is a size 90-14. That probably is the most common size I use, and it may seem very large. You might be thinking, well, gosh, an 80-12 would be better. But I find with some of the more delicate threads, I know this is counterintuitive for some people, but for some of the more delicate threads, I find having a slightly larger needle with a deeper groove does a better job of protecting my thread. But for all of these, do test stitch. So before you stitch on your project, do some test stitching. Make sure that that really is the right combination for you. 80-12 might be a better one, or you might have to go up to a 116. You need to do some testing. But I would say for me, for doing a lot of decorative stitching, and even for a lot of my machine embroidery, 90-14 is a very common size for me to use. And again, it's mostly for the protection of your thread as it passes through the fabric to keep it from abrading. So that's the reason. There's always logic. Now, another tool to use when you're doing decorative stitching is stabilizer. Now, when I say stabilizer, one easy to find stabilizer is just plain starch, like spray starch. There's products on the market calledTerial Magic or Palmer Pletch is Perfect Sew that also work great. But in a pinch, honestly, some people even like to make their own starch. They have their own recipe for it. But this is something the heirloom sewers know very well. They're used to starching everything. And hello, Denise from Tennessee. Hope you're having good weather there as well. Sometimes your spring weather can be kind of violent, both of you, Iowa and Tennessee. So hope you're having good weather. Anyhow, so stabilizers make a big difference on how your decorative stitching works, because when you're decorative stitching, because the stitch is wide, you have the needle tension and bobbin tension will tend to pull those stitches toward the center, and that can cause the fabric to pucker. And so there's another thing that can cause your decorative stitching not to look real great. So if you start your fabric, if it's a washable fabric, and you can start your fabrics first, that will help immensely. Now there's other kinds of stabilizers as well I want to share with you here. And so here's my fabric, and unfortunately I'm working on a white surface here, but these are regular machine embroidery stabilizers. These are a couple different kinds. Now these are removable. This type actually has a backing on it. I'll be using it in a bit. This is a wash-away stabilizer. So this wash-away stabilizer, as the name implies, can be washed off. And this one happens to be sticky. It's a self-sticking wash-away stabilizer. And of course, I'm just having a terrible time. I'll come back to that because I need to peel off. But this is a tear-away stabilizer. And if you're not sure what your stabilizer is, this is a sulky stabilizer called Tear Easy, and it does tear easily. So you use this under your fabric to support the fabric while you're stitching, and that keeps the stitches from being able to pucker that fabric up, to draw it in and pucker it up. Okay, so this is a tearaway. I'm just going to use the wash away since I have it here. So let me just do a better job of getting this peeled off here. There we go. So again, this is self-sticking. They have non-sticky type too. Also, I should say, non-sticky type also. And either one works. The non-sticky type is less expensive. You can use a wash away glue stick to stick it on temporarily if you need to. So there's more than one way to do things. Always more than one way. So I'm just going to peel off a piece of this and place it on the wrong side of my fabric. They make iron-on stabilizers. There's just all different kinds. But the point is, anytime you're going to be stitching a decorative stitch, you want some kind of stabilizer. Whether it's spray starch or what have you, you want to have something, right, to make sure that your fabric is supported. Alrighty, so now in terms of actually stitching this. So you really want to have, when you're stitching a decorative stitch, it's good to have some kind of guideline. It's some kind of guideline to help your stitches be accurate. Now, I didn't accurately cut my fabric because it's just for a sample. So you're just going to pretend I stitched or cut this square. I must have been not paying attention. But the important thing to understand is that you do want to make sure that you mark with some chalk or something, some kind of line that you can see that's, hopefully erasable. This is chalk, so I can brush that off if I really try. Chalk works really well. I love chalk markers. This is an air erasable marker. There's also water erasable markers and heat erasable markers. So whatever works. Now on this kind of darker fabric, this gray chalk, it's not as clear on camera for you, but I can see it really well for myself. And this is important because, again, if you're just decorating fabric, if you don't have, say, the edge of a cuff or something to work off of, you're going to need a line. And what happens with some decorative stitching is that, again, if it's moving around, you need some kind of visual aid. Again, this is more for the different types of stitching, but let's take this to the machine. Now, I know that I didn't put my stabilizer quite all the way to the edge, so I didn't mark all the way to the edge. I'm just going to set my foot down to hold that in place for a second. So you can see that marking much better on this camera, even if the color is not real accurate at the moment. Let me switch to look at some of these decorative stitches here. And let's see, needle art. So all different kinds of decorative stitches. Every machine is different in terms of what you'll have available to play with. Let's see, maybe that's not what I wanted. Maybe I'll go, no, needle art. I love sometimes you get kind of overwhelmed just looking, but just, pick something. Pick something. I'm just going to choose something real simple. Let's just go like 11. That'll go pretty fast. So on your machine, it may tell you what foot to use. In this case, it's telling me it wants me to use a 1A foot. I know your machine may not be quite as fancy as mine. Or actually what it's telling me is I'm using the 1A foot, but it's recommending the 2A foot. That's what it's doing. And here, this little symbol here is telling me you need to use stabilizer. So see what I mean? Even my machine says, remember to use stabilizer with that. So just to point out some of the things. Now, again, I strongly recommend anytime that you're sewing decorative stitches to do testing. Test. So important. But we're going to just go ahead and stitch. Now, I don't have decorative thread. Well, actually, it is decorative. Take that back. It is a rayon thread up top. And actually, it wants me to actually disengage my dual feed. And so when you're stitching a decorative stitch, another thing to bear in mind is just to make sure that you sew at a nice consistent speed. I'm going to set my needle down because I've got my beginning thread here sticking out, and that's kind of ugly. I'm just going to pull that out for a second here. If you have a start stop, now let me grab a different camera here. Okay, some machines have a start stop where you can sew without using your foot pedal. And for some people, if you have a problem, or not a problem, if it's challenging sometimes to sew at a regular speed, sometimes it's good to manually set the speed and just go ahead and use that start stop button. But definitely try to maintain a consistent speed. Now you notice here I'm not even like touching my fabric, right? That's another important point. I'm kind of doing that on purpose because your sewing machine has the ability to sew reasonably straight, right? So another thing to really be careful about when you're sewing decorative stitches is don't oversteer. Like sometimes I think, because especially now I'm doing a real simple design, it's less than 9 millimeters, so it fits in my foot. But if they're doing a real wild one, let me grab, actually, I'm going to grab a real quick, a more dramatic stitch here. Let's see, let's go to my menu and we'll go get something. Now the foot I'm using may not like what I'm about to do. So, it's not going to be, the best choice, but I want you to see something a little more dramatic here. Well, that's kind of a similar stitch. Let's do that one. Okay, so kind of a similar stitch, but bigger stitch. All right. But on this stitch, it's much bigger. Do you see how my machine is actually moving beyond the regular sewing area? So in this case, I actually can't see my hands, but I actually am keeping my hands near my fabric. And mostly what I'm trying to do is keep this always parallel to my needle. So I can't keep this in center position or it won't stitch it correctly. But what I'm watching is to make sure that I keep my marked line parallel to the lines on the markings on my foot. So doing these really big stitches where the machine moves definitely takes a little bit more, practice. So again, mark some lines, do some practice to make sure that you're staying straight on. So that's what I'm watching. I'm just keeping my fabric. You can't see my hand off to the side here, holding on to my fabric or just kind of monitoring it. But I think you get the idea. But it takes practice to be able to do this accurately so that your stitches stay on target. So this is the stitch I was using. Now, this is not the foot it wants me to use, but it did okay. And, a lot of that's because, we have stabilizer on there. And that stabilizer gives that support to make sure that your stitches are able to form, but your fabric stays nice and smooth. Okay, and the amount of stabilizer you need does depend somewhat on the fabric you're using. So with that note, let's go ahead and look at some inspiration of how to do decorative stitching. But again, the stabilizer is super important. I'm just going to take a moment to say hello to Jan, my fellow Washingtonian, and Janie, of course, my friend Janie Lance says, welcome spring, and I completely agree, my friend. It's really welcome. So it's good to see you, even virtually. And August is asking, could you use this to make a decorative hem? Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm actually going to show you some decorative seams, some hems, and even some fabrics. So just wanted to start with some of the tools and techniques of how to do decorative stitching. Now let's look at some inspiration of things you might want to do. But yes, August, absolutely, you absolutely can use decorative stitching to make a beautiful hem. So I'm just trying to decide where to start, right? So let me go to my overhead here. And let's start with let's start with something simple, a real simple way to use decorative stitching. Now this is, let me see, this looks kind of dark on my screen. Let's lighten that up a little bit. So this, actually I'm going to put on the close-up. There we go, that's better. All right. So now the seaming, this particular seam is actually a specialty technique, but on each side of it, each side of this special stitch. So I don't know if you can see my finger there. There's actually airspace, see, between. This is called it's called bundled faggoting, or else another word for it is what I want to say Spanish hem stitching, or maybe it's Swedish hem stitching. Anyhow, there are feet for doing this. Now I cheated and used a fringe foot to do this one, but that's a different topic for another day. That's a decorative seaming technique using a special foot. But anyhow, but on either side of it. So this is, as you can see, it's fairly sheer. This is a handkerchief weight linen. And anytime you're working with a fabric that is sheer or semi-sheer, you really have to think about finishing. So this is the back. And so what I've done that hopefully will be inspirational for you, or a way to fix things. Oops, move my sticky note there. So what I did was, after I sewed the initial seam, the raw edges of the seam allowance were turned under so they met up with the side of the seam. So just basically folded in half, or folded under toward the garment. And then I sewed, I think I took a piece of sticky stabilizer. I think I put a piece of sticky stabilizer to hold it all in place and to stabilize it. In fact, I'm pretty darn sure that's what I did. I took my rotary cutter and cut strips of sticky wash away stabilizer and basically taped down that seam the way it had been pressed. And then this is actually a knit overcast stitch. So this isn't even supposed to be a decorative stitch, but I really liked the way it looked. The width was perfect to catch that seam allowance, hold it in place. And it's really, I have to really look to make sure, okay, which is the right side, which is the wrong side, which is exactly what you want when you're working with some of these more sheer fabrics. So it was a decorative used to just highlight the sides of a decorative. Okay, now I have another example using the same seaming technique, but a little bit more elaborate stitching. So put this on the bigger. So when people see this particular vest, so this is a little fitted vest, and when people see this, they often think that it has lace sewn on it, but it's not. This is all stitching. So, oh, Marie, hi Marie from warm, sunny North Dakota, she says. Well, I'm glad to hear it's warm and sunny in North Dakota. That's great. You deserve it. Make up for all those winter days. So anyhow, so this is that same fancy seam technique, but in this case, a much bigger, more dramatic stitch. So this is a 9mm wide stitch, actually designed by my friend Angie Spong in New Zealand. And again, it's just used on both sides of the seam, because you can use decorative stitches to call out, to draw attention to construction details. So, I mean, this happens to be an open, that, that hem stitching, but you could use this, you can use decorative stitches to highlight any seam. It doesn't even have to be a fancy seam. A real common one is to use top stitching, and I just realized I didn't throw down, I was going to grab an example of just using straight stitches. You can just use straight stitches, top stitch, edge stitch, along the edges of your seams. That's real common to use. Like the question was asked earlier about decorative hems. Well, think about, if you think about Chanel, classic Chanel jackets, back when Chanel was actually designing, she often did what's called channel stitching. And by that, I mean, it's literally rows of straight stitches. So not even using a decorative stitch, but just rows of straight stitching. And if you have enough of them and they're perfectly straight, perfectly even, there's the challenge. You've got to do your practice to get them perfectly parallel. Don't say that too many times quickly, but perfectly parallel rows of straight stitching. That is an incredibly wonderful way to embellish a project, especially a garment. So again, just using stitching to highlight hems or seams, cuffs, and things. Those are all great ideas. And by the way, I did put these in your notes on your handout, so make sure to get that. So a question was asked: does a stretcher hoop work to stabilize the fabric when doing this? And the answer is absolutely yes, you can use a hoop, but here's the problem. If you're using a stretcher hoop, whenever you run out of hoop space, you've got to move the hoop. So for me, for what I like to do, it's more practical for me if I'm doing machine sewing. Now, I do a lot of machine embroidery, like, obviously the lapels on my little jacket. So in that case, of course, it's hooped, and the machine has to stitch within the hoop. But if you're doing long rows or if you're doing garment pieces, it's not always practical to hoop it. But stabilizer, especially if it's tearaway or sticky, stabilizer can be put on, any length. You can just cut more pieces of it, right? So yes, you can use a hoop, absolutely, but there are limitations. Nothing's perfect. There are limitations in that eventually, if you can work with it, stay within that hoop and move it around your machine. So if you do machine, you can do ribbon embroidery, for example, by machine, and that we use a hoop for that, because you really do need to keep it very, very taut and very, very under control. But for regular decorative stitching, usually just using some stabilizer is adequate. You don't quite need as much support as it takes for a hoop. So hooping, like one of the reasons we have to use hooping in machine embroidery is because these designs are very dense. And so they don't always stretch out, these designs are very dense. So there's a lot of that push and pull. We call that compensation in embroidery world. We call it compensation. So on one hand, you have thread going into the fabric, and that causes things to bubble, causes the weave structure, the fabric to move, which can cause ripples. But on the other hand, you have that thread tension from the needle and the bobbin wanting to pull the stitches in. So again, in machine embroidery land, my friend Janie is an expert at that. In machine embroidery land, we have to literally take those things into consideration when we're designing a machine embroidery. We have to think about compensation and how to structure the stitches accordingly and how much stabilizer to use. So even though it's hooped. So anyhow, great questions. Keep them coming. So thank you, Sandy. She likes the vest. Some more examples. Now, just to remind you, even some of the most basic machines have a lot of built-in stitches. So use the stitches you have. Look and see what they have available. Or even like on that, the handkerchief linen jacket, those were actually utility stitches, or that's what they're called, utility stitches. But that doesn't mean they can't be decorative in the way that you use them. Now, this is an example I thought you might enjoy seeing of decorative sewing stitches that are built into a machine. Now, again, I know not everybody has, a super fancy sewing machine, but my point is look and see what your machine has built in, because you might surprise yourself on what's available. So now these are actually sewing stitches that are built into the machine I'm sewing on. This is just a seam, but it's a special seaming technique, but it's just decorative stitching. This is another form of decorative stitching called a radiant stitch. And they're designed so that when you use them around a corner, around curves, or a straight line, they always stay lined up perfectly. So, even going down my zipper or around my pockets, they're going to stay evenly spaced. So look at your machine manual, see what kind of stitches are available to you, and play with them. Get it out and play with them. Now, some of you might be thinking, gosh, I would never do anything that fancy. I'd never wear anything that fancy. But you don't have to. This is the beautiful thing, is you can use decorative stitches just to decorate fabric, just to make fabric. And actually, that's a really great way to practice these techniques. Now, it can be just something really small. This was a project that I created for to launch a very basic machine. And this is a piecework design called, well, we call it, I call it stack and whack. But at any rate, it's a very simple patchwork design that you can kind of switch around and make it look random. But it just started out with squares that were just stitched upon. So on these squares, you just cover them with thread. You don't have to worry about straight lines. You don't have to worry about, really what it looks like. You can use all different colors of thread. Now, of course, I'm a fancy person, so the fabric is silk charmeuse and silk velvet, but these were all starched. So the fabric was starched, and then sticky wash away stabilizer was put behind it while I was stitching. So it was like a piece of cardboard. It was not slick and shiny and scary when I was sewing on it. When everything was completely done, it was all sewn. Then it got washed out, and it was, now it's all soft and everything, but not when I was sewing. But the point is that you can use, and some of these are utility stitches. Again, this was a very, very basic sewing machine that this scarf was sewn on. And there's even the seams have stitching. So this is kind of a crazy quilt stitching that's sewn right down the center of the seam. So again, you don't even have to sew on each side of the seam. You can decorate the seam itself by using decorative stitching. And just create a project like this. Create a project like this where you don't have to worry about it being perfect. You're just making fabric. You're just decorating fabric. And Kathleen is asking, how do I quilt layers with decorative stitching? Kathleen, again, this is where you're going to want to you're going to want to make yourself some samples, Kathleen. The main thing you're going to have to watch for when you're quilting with decorative stitching is your tensions. Again, needles really important. You're probably going to want a pretty substantial top stitching needle for that to protect your thread from the abrasion of all those layers that the thread is passing through. Sometimes that can cause, especially if you're using a decorative thread like a rayon, it can cause them to break or get shredded. So make sure you use a good needle, Kathleen. And again, test. You're going to test. You're going to want to check your tensions. You may need to loosen your needle tension a little bit. You may also want to play around with the length of your stitching to make it look the way you want. But the key here, Kathleen, is make sure that you go ahead and do some testing. Now, Eileen is asking, she says, I did some very long decorative stitching on a large fabric for machine dust cover. I found the stitches on a large fabric can go more wonky than smaller pieces. Absolutely. Any tips for keeping a large fabric straight and smooth without pulling it? Eileen, that is so common. It definitely can, wonky is a good word for it. It can definitely get more wonky than on smaller pieces. Again, my main tip, Eileen, would be there's never such thing as too much stabilizer. Honestly, the stiffer you can make that fabric, again, you try, and when I say stabilize, as long as it's something that is washable. If it's not washable, it's a little more challenging. You've got to stick to your tearaways. And if it's going to be lined, you can even use a cutaway. But generally, if one layer won't do, put another layer on there. So, I mean, the first rule, one of the first things I would say is there's almost no such thing as too much stabilizer. So, Eileen, in your case, one thing I would consider doing is using maybe even a temporary basting spray like your KK2000 or similar. If to help baste a tearaway stabilizer to the back of that while you're stitching to keep things from shifting and to keep it absolutely flat and smooth and almost hard while you're stitching. Yeah, and again, make sure you have your markings on there to keep you on task. It's difficult. So yeah, what you encountered, Eileen, totally normal. And the main thing is just, again, stabilize as best you can. Ideally, you starch and stabilize. And it's funny because in the heirloom sewing world, they've been using starch forever. But for us, the quilters and garment sewists, we don't always think to do those things. But anyhow, yes, larger pieces are more difficult. Now, sometimes I've been known to cheat. So here's another example of decorating fabric. Now this was cheating because a lot of it was done in an embroidery hoop, computerized. But again, just to give you some more inspiration for just making fabric. Now, obviously, like I said, some of this takes a special machine, but let's see, close up. But these are actually built-in sewing stitches. So these are these big, oh yeah, excellent idea. Kathleen Carla has a tip. Carla said, practice making lots of pot holders to check out quilting with decorative stitches. That's an excellent suggestion, Carla. Thank you. Excellent suggestion. Yeah, again, start small. Make some projects, pot holders, perfect pot holders, table runners, all kinds of stuff. Placemats. But yeah, I love the pot holder idea. So again, thank you, Carla. But again, this is just decorating fabric to make things that I'm going to cut up into pieces for quilting. And it's just a great way to play. So this is basically the same idea as that scarf, but just a much bigger project with much bigger squares. So, but the trick to working with, this is silk velvet again. And the trick to working with silk velvet is always to starch the heck out of it. So, I mean, I literally like get out a can of Niagara or whatever I have on hand. Sometimes it's Cereal Magic. People will ask about best press. And best press is great for pressing. But best press is not stiff enough to use as a stabilizer. So I love best press. It's great stuff. But it is not stiff enough to do the job for this. All right? It's not stiff enough. But I have one more inspiration to show you. I mean, I have a lot more examples, but they're up above me. Question was asked. I'm gonna actually answer this first. Shelly's asking, is there a website or something available to help you research and figure out what stabilizer to use on what material? Yes, if you go to any, you go to Silk. I know Sulky's website. We'll talk about their various stabilizers. Floriani, anyone who sells stabilizer is going to usually have a link on their website that talks about what the different stabilizers are used for. But in a nutshell, Shelly, since we still have some time here. So when we talk about stabilizers, besides the fact that there's almost no such thing as too much, what you have to think about is ultimately when I'm deciding what type of stabilizer to use, rather than how much, but what type of stabilizer to use, you need to think about how am I going to remove it? Or do I need to remove it? So that's the key. Do you need to remove it? And if so, how? So that's where we get into wash away versus tear away versus cut away. So cut away is basically permanent. You've all seen it's usually, we use cutaway on knit fabrics so that the design is permanently supported and doesn't get all wonky in washing and things. So in the case of a cutaway, if I need a lot of it, I use multiple layers of a very thin one so that I can cut it. I can grade the outside that's left in layers so it's not one big thick edge. But usually for my decorative stitching, a lot of times it's on something that I can use either wash away or tear away. Now, wash away is often my first preference. It depends if I'm working, say, on the silks, because silks that are washable. Now, the Dupioni I'm wearing, I can guarantee I have tear away underneath. This is lined, so, but it's tear away under here because I'm not going to wash silk Dupioni. It always gets dry cleaned because if you wash it, it gets softer. I don't always want it to get softer. Some Dupionis will turn into a rag if you wash them. But anyhow, think about how you want to remove it. And that's really kind of one of the most important considerations. And again, the wider and more elaborate your stitch is, and like the more stitches. So the stitches on, so some of the stitches I used on that quilt are these what we call maxi hand, and this is it's the FOF where they're located. These are actually sewing stitches. So the machine goes sideways to sew these. These take much more stabilizer than these simple stitches do, because these simple stitches only move around so much, right? I mean, this is a wide one. This is actually one of the stitches from this collection. So this stitch often will take more stabilizer than this stitch, just because there's more movement, there's more chance for the thread to pull in. All right, so that's something to think about in terms of how much stabilizer. If you need multiple layers of stabilizer to keep everything flat and smooth, one thing you'll take into consideration is how wide are those stitches. And like in this case, the machine actually stitches each one it's a triple stitch, so it's going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so again, you're going to have more compensation pull on these type of stitches. So that's excellent question. So feel free to keep asking, but again, when it comes to stabilizer information, I mean, I do have classes online that talk about stabilizer. In fact, for Craftsy, I have a class on embroidering denim. So one of the sections in the class on embroidering denim for Craftsy talks about stabilizer. We talk about stabilizer a lot in that class. So there's always, any class that's talking about embroidery should be talking about stabilizer. But again, just go to the website for the manufacturer of that stabilizer. I use mostly Sulky products, Sulky or Inspira. So, you know, I know that Sulky has information on their website. So you can go to sulky.com. All right, but one more piece of inspiration I want to show you. Now, this is what I'm showing you. I did not make this. This is ready to wear. I actually found this on, I think I found it on eBay. This is a Tahari jacket. So it's, you know, it was ready to wear, or is ready to wear. But look at the decorative stitching. Now I'm going to put it on the keep it on this, and then I'll put it on close up. But these are all decorative. This is all decorative stitching. There is a princess seam. So here's the actual seam here. But the rest of this shaping isn't, it's all just done with the way that they laid out these stitches. Is that not just unbelievable? I had, needless to say, had to have this jacket when I saw it online. I couldn't believe it. And a lot of these stitches, especially some of these smaller ones, now this looks like that, some of those new stitches I just showed you, new stitches for my machine. But like on this sleeve, these aren't quite so big. You can see compared to my fingernail. And these are more like what a lot of machines are going to have built in. So they don't have to be huge. Like here's just straight stitching. And look, they weren't even always totally consistent about how they laid it down. But oh my goodness, it's such an amazing piece because of the way that they used all these different stitches just to embellish the fabric for this jacket. And of course they did. It's just an amazing job. There's even, I'll show you, there's even fake pockets. So this is down on, it has kind of like almost a little bit of a peplum here, and the edges are bound. So this is a denim jacket. It's basically like a really lightweight denim or a heavy cotton. So there's some channel stitching, just plain straight stitch. But I love just even like the little fake pockets. So it looks like a pocket on the jacket, but it's not, it's just stitching. It's just super incredible jacket. Let me see, the back is, again, I mean, of course there are princess seams running here, but the majority of this is just, even the yoke, there isn't actually a yoke on this jacket. It just looks like there's a yoke because of the way they did the decorative stitching. So this is I love this jacket, even though I didn't sew it myself. It's my ultimate decorative stitching inspiration example. That, so, you know, for example, so here, like if you wanted to sew something like this, on this back piece, I would start with the yoke, and I would embellish it with thread, do most of the stitching before I actually sewed the seam. So this seam here, they did the decorative stitching first, and it looks like they seamed it then, because actually they didn't quite get it perfect. Here, this row of straight stitching is actually disappearing into the seam right here at the armhole. So they did do all the stitching beforehand, and then they just carefully marked their seam allowances. So they carefully marked their seam allowances so that hopefully this edge stitching wouldn't actually disappear like it does here at the armpit. But if you trace all your stitching lines, then you can use that. They just built on that. So they would have stitched along the edge, following their seam lines down here and around here. They obviously wanted to have this coming down the center of the jacket, of course echoed here, and then they just filled in the middle. Now the yoke, I would have actually done the yoke first before I did this section. The yoke, draw your yoke and do your first row of decorative stitching. And then just echo, what we call echo quilt. In quilting, we call it echo quilting if you're quilting something, but it's basically echo quilting in a sense that you're just echoing that line, getting smaller and smaller. And it's not a perfect echo. So see how it gets shallower kind of as we go. So they get closer together here at the shoulder, and then they lengthen out here. But that's all something you can design. And again, use your wash away or heat away pencils. Test first. But you don't have to have an embroidery machine to do some pretty fantastic things, on a garment with just decorative stitches. So I'm excited to have an excuse to show you this jacket because it really is just such an inspirational piece. And look how they did the shaping of the stitches here on the side panels. Okay, so let's see if there's any other questions here. Hopefully I've answered. I see I've got some coming in. Oh, and I have some questions up here on my Facebook side. So I'm just going to look up there. So I'm looking up at on the Facebook side of things, and Max is going to help me with those. Someone said, asking, curious, how much was the jacket? Honestly, I don't remember. I don't remember how much the jacket was. I probably blanked it from my mind, but it probably wasn't more than, I don't know. I really don't remember. I mean, maybe it was $100. It probably wasn't more than $250. I don't know. So, but that's a good question. But I'm one of those people that because I sew for a living and I teach sewing for a living, I actually do kind of haunt, eBay and Etsy for some of these vintage garments for inspiration, because I learn a lot from them from construction, and I always come up with good ideas for teaching for decorative things. Question was asked, when you use wash away, do we have to worry about the stitches coming out of the material because there's no more stabilizer? Is that a concern? That's an excellent question, Shelley. But no, actually, the stitches are just left behind. And actually, that reminds me of something. Thank you, Shelley. For some fabrics that have a lot of loft to them, like velvet, if it's a poofy fabric, towels are another one. Like maybe you want to do like a decorative border on your towels. This is a stabilizer film. This is still in the package, so I'm just going to leave it there. But this is a real thin, kind of looks like saran wrap, but it's not. But it's a wash away film. So when I'm embroidering or stitching on like things like velvet, I always have a layer of this on top as well. And thank you for reminding me again, stabilizer. If you're using something, this is Solvay film again by Sulky. Oops, upside down. So at any rate, that you put a layer of that on top. That's we call it a floater sometimes. Well, actually, we call it a floater and put it on the bottom. But it's wash away film. And there's heat away film too. But wash away is a little more common. So the film sits on top, and that helps support the stitches to so they don't sink in. But no, that's an excellent question, Shelley. But no, when you wash away the stabilizer, what's left is beautiful stitches. It doesn't take the stitching with it, because the stitching is lock stitched into your fabric. The stabilizer is not so thick that it affects it that way. But that's an excellent question. I'm sure you're not the only person who is wondering. And it made me think about this. So Eileen's asking, thank you all for all the great questions. Eileen's asking, what is the heaviest weight thread you use? The heaviest weight thread I've used is, actually, I'm going to go run and grab it real quick. I can talk while I go. It's a 12 weight. I think it's, 12 weight. This might even be an 8. See if I can find one. It's actually silk buttonhole thread, and it's super, super thick. That's not it. Let's see if I can find a spool of it here real quick. I should have grabbed it beforehand. So there we go. There's a spool. So 12 weight cotton is usually about as thick as I go, but I'll show you this. Now this is thread that requires at least a size 100 needle. Believe it or not, they make size 110 needles too. Let me just put this on my, so this is how thick this thread is. This is silk buttonhole thread. It's hard to find. It's actually called quilter silk. It's really meant for, like it says, for patchwork quilt, for hand sewing, but with a big enough needle, you can put it through your machine. So this is real unusual. But, you know, again, I work with this kind of stuff. So this is what I like to play with. But it makes absolutely gorgeous top stitching. Sometimes you really have to play with your tensions because it's slippery. So you can have some puckering. So this is really thick, but this is, I think, this is pearl crown rayon. Again, if you have a thick enough, if your machine doesn't mind, so sometimes it depends on your machine. But sometimes if you have a real big needle, you can use real big thread. So you think about jeans thread, you know, it's pretty darn thick. But 12 weight cotton is pretty common to use. I use that. Again, I work with Sulky, so 12 weight cotton is pretty common. But this is, I don't use the pearl crown rayon very much. If I did, you can also think about, you can also do decorative stitching by putting something like this in your bobbin and bypassing your bobbin tension. So that's called bobbin work. And that's another thing you can do to create decorative stitching. But this silk, heavy silk thread is the quilter silk. I think Superior might carry it, but it's imported from Japan. So anyway, that's probably one of the thickest threads I normally would work with. Question was asked by Deborah, how do you deal with running out of thread while stitching decorative stitching? Oh, that's an excellent question. Well, honestly, Deborah, the main trick is to, every time you get done with a row, look at your bobbin and watch your spools and make sure that you don't run out. Another reason to do test stitching, though, in all seriousness, Deborah, another reason to do test stitching is because one of the things you have to learn for that decorative stitch is where it starts in the pattern. Okay, some machines, they'll show you on the screen. If it has a computer screen, it'll show you where the stitch starts. If you know where the stitch starts, if you have an oops, it happens to us all. And because it might not even be running out of thread, it might be a thread break. Then you can at least find out if you hit oftentimes if you reselect the stitch, it'll start at the beginning again. And then you can figure out where on that stitch basically you left off. You can figure out where the beginning of that pattern is again. And then if you have to rip it, at least you only have to rip back to where, you know, you're going to start again. So Deborah, it's just, you know, when that happens, we all just take a big sigh of unhappiness. And sometimes you have to rip and sometimes you can restart it. It just depends on the project. It depends on how elaborate the pattern is. But if you're really careful and you know where that pattern, what the first stitch is of that design, oftentimes you can go back. But, you know, my best tip for that is honestly just number one, make sure you start with a full bobbin and just keep an eye on it. Like really keep an eye on it because it does go through thread quick. But just be very, very diligent. Try not to do that. That's the best tip. Yeah, don't forget to, I know Max has put up a link for the little, the handout for this class. And so that's, there you go. You put the QR code on the screen so you can have a copy of the notes for this, including some tips for inspiration and that sort of thing. Just looking to see up here on my screen. You're here, my screen's up here. If there's any other questions, I don't think that there are. So just looking at the various questions here. So, all right, I think we've got it covered. So thank you all for tuning in. Again, thank you all for all the great questions and have a great weekend and happy sewing, everybody.